Hi, Wade Galt with Smart Bonus Systems here. In this video, we're going to talk about lapse rate and income, how one simple number is always determining how much wealth, success, and free time you can get out of your business. Now, in the previous video, we talked about renewals, gains, and multi-lines and how you can simplify your staffing plan and compensate your team members to be stars. We discussed the idea that if you have, let's say, 60% of your income is coming from renewals, that of course that's going to be a consistently huge part of your business. We need to make sure we're really taking care of that. We talked about the retention expert and how important it is for them to maintain a low lapse rate and how we're going to compensate them to renew existing business and keep that lapse rate low. Now I'm going to show you a very simple case study that shows 10 years of renewals in the sample agency. We're assuming a 20% new sales rate. So by 20% new sales rate, that means let's say you had 1,000 total policies in your agency and you sold 200 in a year, 200 new policies. That would be 200 over 1,000 is 20%. And we're going to show an example here that just looks at 100,000 of P&C renewals. So if you have exactly 100,000 of P&C renewals, this is your agency. Or if you have multiples of that, you can just multiply this numbers times however many hundreds of thousands of P&C renewals you have. First, let's look at the concept of lapse rate and how it relates to how many years a client stays with you. Right here in this third row, if you have a 25% lapse rate, your client's going to stay with you about 4 years. So think about that. If a quarter of your business, 25% of it, leaves you every year, after 4 years, you would have lost the equivalent of 1 year's worth of business of your agency. It doesn't mean you'd have no agency. It just means you'd have turned over the equivalent of one of your agencies. If you had a 20% lapse rate, that would happen every 5 years. If you had a 10% lapse rate, that would happen every 10 years. So lapse rate is going to make a huge difference as to how long you keep clients. Now, if we look at the concept that we've got a 20% sales rate, if we take a plus 20 and subtract 30% of your business, so 20 minus 30 would be a negative 10% gain rate, or in essence, a loss. If you had a 20% lapse rate and 20% new sales rate, you'd be at 0%, no gain. And if you had a 20% new sales rate and you only lost 10%, you'd have a 10% gain rate. So depending on your lapse rate and your new sales rate, we get your gain rate, which is really the most important number of the three, is what is the net gain. So if I'm selling at a 30% rate, but I'm losing at a 30% rate, that doesn't help me. And the same thing goes. If I'm at a 10% lapse rate, but I can't sell anything new, then perhaps I need to get more aggressive with my marketing and selling. Now what I've done here is run some numbers and said, what if we had this 30% lapse rate? Over the 10 years, this agency would have $586,000 worth of renewals. That would mean that it averaged $58,000 per year. And you'd say, well, what happened to that $100,000? Well, it's decreasing every single year. So there's a much lower amount by the end of the 10 years. They're not even averaging $100,000 per year. Because right here in the middle, with that 0% growth rate, they would have $100,000 per year times 10 years would be $1 million of renewals. So again, they'd average $100,000 a year. If you go at the bottom, with a 10% lapse rate, they'd have a 1.75 million of renewals over the 10 years, or averaging 75% more, 175,000 as opposed to the 100,000 per year. If you look at that on a graph, plain and simply, again, here's our baseline in the middle, zero growth. We're staying at 100,000 per year times 10 years equals $1 million of total renewal commissions over those 10 years. At the low end, we have almost half that, and at the high end, we've got 75% more. So that 10% lapse rate equals 75% more money over 10 years per $100,000. If we look at it over 20 years now, the numbers multiply and become even bigger. So this is kind of like when you show a client the future value of their money as they invest in compound interest. It's the later years where the numbers start getting bigger. So in this case, with the 30% lapse rate, after 20 years, we've got 790,000 of total renewals over that 20-year period. So that's averaging 39,000 per year. If we're at the middle, that 20% lapse rate with the 20% gain rate, so zero growth, we've got 100,000 times 20 equals 2 million. So that's our middle. And even just a slightly lower lapse rate leads to 600,000 more of renewals over those years. So that's 30,000 more per year off of 2.5%. 5% difference leads to 3.4 million instead of 2 million. 7.5% lapse rate difference equals 4.6 million instead of 2 million. And at 10%, we've got 6.3 million. That's 3 times the income that you would have had over those 20 years. If you look at 30 years of renewals, it just gets staggering. At that negative 10% gain rate, we've hardly gained at all. The business is just about gone. If you were to look at the total renewals per year, we still only have 861,000 over the 30 years. That's 28,000 per year average. At the 0%, again, we've got 3 million. That's 30 years times 100,000. And at the 10% lapse rate, we've got $18 million of renewals. That's 6 times the income. That's you and your agency grossing an average of 603,000 of renewals per year as opposed to 100,000. That's how big of a difference lapse rate makes. So when we create the compensation plan in the next video, we're going to start out with renewals and retention and policy growth being the core focus of the plan and building from there. Hope you found this video extremely helpful. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.